It is a joy to be with you on this Palm Sunday morning, a time that is awkwardly placed in the liturgical calendar, if we're honest. It's a time that finds us beginning the service in celebration, a procession of children, shouts of Hosanna, and a time that we will end our service departing into silence. And so what I'd like to explore with you this morning is what it means to look at this single day from different perspectives. Now, as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of something that I really enjoyed as a kid. You all know, many of you know, that I am a New Testament scholar by training. I did not end up going down the sciencey path, but as a kid, I loved seeing pictures of things that were magnified under microscopes to great degrees. So I want to show you a couple of examples here. Now, I know that we probably have some folks in the room who might be able to identify this. Don't give it away. But take a look, see if you can wonder. This is an everyday sort of thing. I promise you will have seen the thing that this comes from. Let's zoom out a little bit more. We get a bit more perspective. See a little bit more of the picture. We zoom out again. More still is becoming apparent to us. Continue to guess. We see even more. Now we'll change it just a bit and add some color. See if you can still guess at what this is. This one might begin to give it away. And finally, we see that all along we have been looking at the wing of a moth. Now, my hunch is that if you are like me, you might have started with this initial picture and never dreamed that it would eventually turn into the moth. There is a difference in perspective. As we zoom out, we are able to see the same thing, yet in different ways. And so this morning, as we turn to our text from Luke 19 and Isaiah 50, let me invite us to look at this text in three ways. Let me invite us to see here Jesus as the coming king, Jesus as the tragic hero, and Jesus as the suffering servant. Let us begin. Jesus, the coming king. Now, this image of Jesus is one that is right at the surface. We do not need to zoom in. We don't need our microscope to see this. It is obvious. Luke even tells us as much in verse 38. The crowds are proclaiming, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven, glory in the highest heaven." This is the shout that goes up for the King who comes. And lest we miss it, if we are to look at Luke's version of this text in comparison with Matthew and Mark's, we find that Luke is even more explicit. Where Matthew and Mark say simply, "Blessed is the one who comes," Luke knows that sometimes his audience is a little slow. We might need some extra help here. "Blessed is the King," Luke says. And beyond that, Luke also tells us that the crowds are shouting, "Peace in heaven." Now, from our own 21st century perspective, we might simply hear these terms and let them wash over us. But let me suggest that in the first century, in the time when the crowds would have proclaimed these were words of treason. This is not "Blessed is the King who rules in Rome." This is not "Blessed is Caesar," "Blessed is the one over the Roman Empire." This is "Blessed is a different king." This is not the peace of Rome. This is not the Pax Romana. This is peace in heaven. The picture of a coming king that Luke gives us is the picture of one who challenges empires, This is the picture of one who is not afraid to cause a stir, who is not afraid to come in to the shouts of the crowd, is not afraid to potentially even cause disruption. Jesus, the coming King. But let us zoom out. Let's zoom out a little bit farther in the Gospel of Luke. Let us zoom out to Luke chapter 9, where in verse 51, Luke tells us, when the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. When we read the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem in light of Luke's larger story, what we might find is not necessarily a coming king, but a tragic hero. This is a Jesus who in chapter 9 realizes that he has a fate, that he must set his face to that fate and go along the path that has been destined for him. A path that we know will not end happily. And what I'd like to suggest is that even embedded in our text in Luke 19, we see hints of the tragic hero as well. Listen again to verse 35. Then they brought the colt to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. Let me put the emphasis elsewhere. They set Jesus on it. They set Jesus. Listen here to the ways that Luke suggests to us that Jesus is already being stripped of his autonomy and agency. Now, lest we think that this is simply a minor detail and I'm reading too much into it, if we look at this same text in Matthew and Mark, what we find is that the Matthean and Markan Jesus does have agency, does set himself upon the animals, but not so in Luke. In Luke, the evangelist changes the language. They sat Jesus on it. The implication seems to be that this tragic hero who in chapter 9 set his face to go to Jerusalem has now begun to divest himself of the power and privilege that he had and has become subject to those who would seat him upon a beast of burden. Jesus, the tragic hero. But let us zoom out once more. Let us zoom out as far as the end of the Gospel of Luke, as far as the prophet Isaiah, whose words we heard earlier, and let us ask what it means to see Jesus as the suffering servant. When we zoomed in, when we looked first just at Luke 19, it seemed on the surface that this was a celebratory story. Look, Jesus coming to conquer. Look, Jesus, the victor returning from war. And yet, when we take a broader perspective, when we zoom out, what we find is that Jesus is not so different than the suffering servant. Here again, the words from Isaiah 50. I gave my back to those who struck me, my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. Isaiah's suffering servant, yes, is one who is also defiant, but is one whose body is bruised and broken and beaten. Whereas once we might have seen Jesus like that unridden colt, untouched, unbroken, now we see Jesus as the suffering servant whose own body will be broken and beaten. What is the perspective we take on this text? Do we see Jesus as the coming king? Do we see Jesus as the tragic hero? Do we see Jesus as the suffering servant? I'd like to suggest that on this Palm Sunday, on this day where we sit awkwardly in this space of a liturgical season, that perhaps we are right to see Jesus as all of these things. The coming king is the tragic hero, is the suffering servant. Jesus is all of these identities wrapped in one. And so this Holy Week then, as we stand on the cusp of Holy Week, it invites us into the uncomfortable reality that we don't always know the whole story. We don't always know which is the right perspective to take on Jesus. On this Palm Sunday, we sit in this discomfort between the shouts of Hosanna and between the shouts of crucify him. And the uncomfortability of this liturgical moment is not so different from the uncomfortability of our own daily experience. After all, we live in a world where each day's news can seem newly horrific, and it can feel difficult to see how any day's given headlines can possibly be pointing towards the justice towards which the larger arc of the moral universe bends. But yet what I want to suggest that we find here is an imperative. An imperative to live as the coming king, to live as the tragic hero, to live as the suffering servant. Because in each of these identities, Jesus himself pushed back against injustice, pushed back against oppression, pushed back against those who would persecute the innocent. And perhaps that is where we can find our imperative, where we can hear the call of Christ on our lives today. Listen again to the words of the suffering servant in Isaiah. Who will contend with me? Let us stand together in court. Who are my adversaries? Let them confront me. It is the Lord who helps me. Who will declare me guilty? These are words of defiance. These are the words of one who, yes, is beaten, who, yes, is broken, but who also knows that God is the God of life and that God is ultimately the one who vindicates the innocent. And so whether we are marching in as victors with the coming king or beaten or bruised like the suffering servant, we can trust that the same God who inspires that Jesus is the God who continues to be present with us. And so let us emulate this figure. Let us be inspired by the coming king, the tragic hero, and the suffering servant, and trust that he walks with us in this Holy Week and in all weeks. Amen.